And joining us now, once again, is Professor Richard Wolff. I always get a lot out of my conversations with Professor Wolff. He is, as regular listeners know, the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is also Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at New York University. You can also find his work at democracyatwork.info, a very informative website he's put together. And with no further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
Well, you know, it's an interesting historical moment, to say the least. And I think you have a special perspective on it because you've been talking for and studying for a long time some of the issues that are only beginning to surface in our political debate, among them the role of socialism or democratic socialism in the political exchange, which has been notably conspicuously missing from the American political scene. And the last time you and I talked, one of the questions that came up, and I've thought about this a lot, is while his fellow Democrats and certainly the Republicans and others are excoriating Bernie for calling himself a democratic socialist, the question arises, is he in fact the last best hope for capitalism? Is capitalism's only chance for survival the agenda of someone like Bernie's that might rescue a foundering system before it destroys itself altogether? So that's where we left off last time. We didn't get a chance to get into it. What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, let me begin by talking a little bit about a growing sentiment on Wall Street. I live and work here in New York City. I'm quite close, partly because of my professional activities and also my interests, to following the conversations down there. Ironically, the stronger Bernie gets, and he's now clearly leading in the polls among Democrats for the primary for president that they are now conducting, the closer he gets to perhaps being the nominee, the more you have, on the one hand, screaming rants, it's really all I can call them, of people who are terrified of socialism. Chris Matthews on television, the pollsters who work and the advisors who work for the Clintons, for Obama, and so on, the centrist Democrats yelling and screaming. But in Wall Street, a growing number of conservatives are now seeing Bernie as a positive, not a negative, beginning to argue a little bit along the lines you suggest, that the American economy is in fact in a very, very vulnerable place. It is nowhere near the so-called great or greatest economy that Mr. Trump keeps repeating, and that the centrist Democrats are simply afraid to call out, which is ironic if you remember that Mr. Trump denounced Obama in the last presidential race for having a fake rendition of a great economy when it wasn't. Now Mr. Trump is in the seat occupied by Mr. Obama, saying exactly what Obama did, but not having a corresponding new Trump to call it out as a fakery, which is what it is. Anyway, these folks in Wall Street are saying, look, the economy hasn't gotten in better shape under Trump. The only thing that has kept it from being a crash economy has been an unprecedented increase in debt. People should understand the level of government debt is much higher now than it was when Mr. Trump took office. The level of corporate debt is much higher now than when Mr. Trump took office. The level of personal debt is higher. In other words, this is a debt-fueled, debt-dependent economy, at the same time that the United States' ability to weather another economic downturn is poorer than it has been for a long time, because the United States does not occupy in the world the position of top dog the way it did as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, because of China above all else, but also because of the United States' withdrawal from large parts of the world that have made the Europeans, and that's a very important economic bloc, much more ambivalent about their alliance with the United States, much more open and interested in doing business with China, as you can see around the Huawei Corporation maneuvers and so on. This is a very vulnerable economy, and the folks on Wall Street, the smarter ones, are beginning to recognize that just like after the Great Depression in the 1930s, it became necessary to have Franklin Roosevelt, a left-winger by American political standards, it is going to be probably similarly necessary to bring in a new Franklin Roosevelt, i.e. Bernie Sanders, who tries very hard to present himself as a new Franklin Roosevelt. It might actually be a very salutary step necessary to be taken, because in the event of a crash, which, as I say, most observers in Wall Street believe is only a question of when, not a question of whether, whenever that comes, you're going to need a lot of effort to prevent a break from capitalism. And these people see in Bernie the kind of saving of capitalism that they credit Franklin Roosevelt for having done before.
You know, it's interesting, Richard Wolff, because on the one hand, you have Elizabeth Warren proudly proclaiming, "I am a capitalist." But her programs, her policies, while many of them are, quite good, they're not as bold or aggressive as Bernie's. And I would agree, by the way, that Bernie's plans could be much more bold and aggressive than they are by historical standards. But they are to me, they are very much in the tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Bernie does not proclaim himself a capitalist. But one thing I've noticed is, whether it's in my own discussions with extremely wealthy people or what they themselves have said in public or to other journalists or what have you, or at Davos or elsewhere, is that while I consider the relentless pursuit of wealth frankly sinister, and while I consider those who excel at it far more likely to be pathological than the average human being, nevertheless, I find among those types of people a very clear-headed kind of realism. And they didn't get there by sugarcoating the facts, either about themselves or opportunities or the economy or anything else. And they're the ones, Robert Johnson, the economist, talks about this a lot. They're the ones building landing strips so they can fly away to New Zealand if society collapses altogether. They're the ones with contingency plans. They're the ones Douglas Rushkoff wrote about. We had Doug on this show, who want to know how to have encampments. The most hard-headed planners in the country also have contingency plans for utter societal collapse. So it seems to me, if they see in Bernie's, by our political standards, quite bold proposals, a chance to save the system, to me that's not at all surprising, nor is it necessarily a reason not to support Bernie by any means. It just says that the people who are, calculating the probabilities think it might be a good thing to have a very FDR-like president and program in this country. Is that fair? You agree with all of that?
Yes, I think that's basically what they're saying. If they know something about history, which some of them do, then they know that Bernie is about the mildest kind of socialist you're going to get, number one. So he's not a scary person on that level. And if you know some history and you know how the government works, you'll know that he will have to work with a Congress that, even if it is sympathetic in some general way to him, is full of people who will be enemies, political and ideological, of anything and everything he tries to do. And then there are those who are smart enough to understand that the government's impact on a capitalist economy like ours is deeply limited from the get-go, no matter who's in office, something presidents have had to learn if they weren't smart enough before. I'm also struck by the fact that the people most anxiety-ridden about a socialist becoming president tend to be the politicians who have built their careers in the last 30, 40, 50 years in which the United States has been engaged in an ideological battle against communism and socialism. And these people have begun to believe their own rhetoric, which often happens. And so for them, a socialist is something you denounce because that's how politics works. And the idea that they actually have to deal with one simply goes beyond what they're able to cognize. So I'm not surprised if the Clintons talk like that, or Obama talks like that, or their advisors talk like that. And like you, I'm much more impressed that the folks on Wall Street understand that whether it's Bernie or somebody else, whether the person calls himself or herself a capitalist or a socialist, really matters less. If capitalism begins to fall apart, which I believe it is already doing in this country, but if that happens, you need politicians who will have some kind of solution. Mr. Trump has been offering a solution, and that is to scapegoat foreigners, to act out a theater that we're holding back an invasion of immigrants, to act out a theater that all of our problems are the fault of other countries not treating us properly, and all of that is going to be fixed by the great negotiator Trump. This is all nonsense. It's economic, it makes no sense at all, but it's good political theater. It's the first pass at trying to save capitalism. As it demonstrates that it doesn't work, that the system is getting more and more fragile, then you're going to have the people who run this country look elsewhere. And Bernie is the only really new and different thing. And he and Elizabeth Warren, as the kind of equivalent, if you like, on this side of the socialism label, those are the people that offer something sharply different. And I'm not surprised that the folks at the top who see that fragility are beginning to take a long and sympathetic look at a better deal to fix the system than Trump has proven himself to be.
So, Richard Wolff, this is at this point I want to introduce the concept you're probably familiar with, and a lot of us on the left are familiar with. The term sometimes used is accelerationist. The school of thought that says this system is vile and corrupt and hateful, this economic system, and oppressive, and we should do nothing to mitigate the suffering or the crises it is producing, because if we do that, it will delay the inevitable revolution. So let's keep allowing things to get lousier and lousier and lousier, because that accelerates the moment of absolute revolution and overthrow of the system. That's how I would describe an accelerationist. So somebody listening to this is saying, well, if they want him because he could save capitalism, then, the hell with him. Let's just let's get somebody, let's get Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar, and even if they go in, it's all going to go to hell, and then we can have a new world. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I pretty strongly disagree with that. I mean, I think two things. One, the left in this country, while it is much stronger than most people either understand or are willing to admit, still doesn't have the strength to make all that much a big difference to how this system evolves, whether it is accelerationist or not. So I don't get too excited about that. My second view is even more strongly opposed to it, because I think most Americans understand that the people at the top, the 1%, the top 5%, it doesn't really matter, the majority for whom this economy is working well are overwhelmingly the people who celebrate it, who think it's great, like President Trump, who celebrate whatever good statistics they can find, like the low unemployment rate, without looking too closely, because if you do, it's not so good anyway. Those people are silent. And if the left, instead of being critical, instead of trying to do something to help people in this bad economic situation, if they become silent, my guess is most people will think of them as like they think of the people at the top, silent because it isn't going badly for them. If you want the mass of people in their suffering, and by suffering I mean carrying debts they cannot support, having to worry that their children can't get a college education without making those debts even worse, worrying about how secure their job is, whether the Social Security will make them paupers when they're in retirement, all of the deepening critical worries of the mass of people. If the left isn't battling to help that get better, then they aren't going to be trusted with being the ones you turn to if the system collapses. The way you become the alternative is not by waiting until the crash happens. You better demonstrate long before that who you are, what you fight for, what your beliefs argue, because only then do you have a chance that when the crisis hits, you will be the direction people decide to follow. Revolutions don't happen because we have a clear prognosis of what's going to happen in the future. They are not made by or won by people with detailed blueprints. What happens is the system falls apart, people become aware of it. Those are two separate things. And when they become aware of it, they look for what to do next, what might help, what might work better. And they turn to the people they know, they turn to the people they've worked with, they turn to the people they might have some reason to trust. And the left has to be that if it's going to have any hope in the time of severe trouble to win its view of where the future should go.
Well said. And again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff. I was thinking as you were speaking about Kierkegaard's quote that life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. I think that's maybe to a certain extent true of revolutions as well, but you're saying, lay the groundwork, be that resource in people's minds when there's a crisis. I think that's right.
But I think if I could interrupt,
sure.
Richard, your point is still very valid, because it's not enough to say you have to be there fighting. It would make you all the more successful if you could be an honest advocate, an honest activist, an honest militant. And by that I mean fight for the reforms, fight for the step forward, however modest, but don't shy away from saying exactly that. I'm fighting for what I can achieve here and now under the constraints, but I'm not a misleader. I'm not going to hype what we're fighting for, a higher minimum wage or a change in the tax structure, and tell you, which has been the crisis of the center left for so long, and tell you it's the solution to your problems. Mass of people have been led down that path. They don't believe it in the large part anyway, and they would be much more impressed and much more likely to follow with real sincerity somebody who says, I'm going to fight for the reform here and now, but I'm going to tell you that without going much further in the direction of social change, these reforms either won't be won, or even if they're won, will prove temporary because we haven't yet made the social changes that can make these reforms secure. Look at what happened in the Great Depression. We really did have an upsurge of reform. We did have the New Deal. We did have a Bernie-like character in FDR. And we made big reforms: Social Security, unemployment insurance, the first minimum wage, and a federal jobs program that hired 15 million people. We achieved a lot of reforms, but an awful lot of people thought that by having those reforms put in, and by having a president like Roosevelt, we would have a reformed capitalism. They didn't go further. They left in place the structure, the capitalist structure in which large numbers of us work to produce profits that go into the hands of a very small number. And guess what? That fact that we didn't change that structure allowed that small number gathering into their hands the profits we all produced for them to use those profits to make sure that the reforms won in the 1930s were taken away in the decades since that. We have to learn from that only the more basic social change can make secure the reforms we fight for.
And I guess the analogy I would give there, Richard Wolff, is that in the area of economics I personally know best, or financing healthcare, the reason why I want to get the insurance industry entirely out of healthcare, the reason why I want for-profit providers and the investment firms that go invest in them out of the healthcare system, is the analogy I use is rust. If you have a rusty fender and you paint over it and put a finish on it, it will look good, but the rust will keep beating away. And so you have to address the rust, the problem of corrosion, in this case, profit-seeking corrosion, at least in my view, in certain segments of the economy, or you can't go forward. But there's something else. Before we get off the whole question of the debates, I mean, there are two thoughts I wanted to express and then get your thought, your reaction to. One, first of all, and you can react or not as you like, but I think it's actually quite astonishing, given our political history of the last 75 years, that there was even a debate about the virtues of socialism televised on behalf of one of the two major political parties. That, to me, is something that not only Bernie can take pride in, but that his entire movement can take pride in. And especially, I would say, and I think Bernie would agree, especially the movement. So that, to me, was striking. And as part of that, I have to say, as perverse as this will sound, I've felt a certain measure of gratitude that Michael Bloomberg was up there on stage, particularly when Bloomberg and Bernie were having it out, because I was thinking to myself, now, I never thought I'd see, this is a kind of class war I'd buy a ticket to, just to see these two go at it from their two perspectives. And maybe I'll close with this. While I said earlier that a lot of Wall Street types are extremely smart and hard-headed about the world around them, they also have the capacity to be astonishingly dense. And Michael Bloomberg, to me, is Exhibit A in this. He's one of all these people who signed on to Pete Peterson's initiatives. We have to cut Medicare and Social Security and tighten our belts because we just, the economy can't take anymore. We have to let our infrastructure crumble or whatever. We can't raise taxes, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to the economy as a whole, as opposed to their own lives, I think they're astonishingly dense. And I think in that Democratic debate, we saw some of that going on. So I threw a lot at you, but what are your thoughts?
Well, let me pick up on two or three of the many points that you made.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Not a problem. First of all, I take my hat off to Bernie right away. I mean, he's already won something incalculably important, no matter what happens from this point on. He, both in 2016 and now again, he has demonstrated to the American people and to the world that the socialism they thought was over with, what had become a historical anachronism, whatever the wishful thinking of the people who wanted to believe it, that socialism has once again proven that it isn't dead, that it is capable of inspiring a whole new generation of young people with an alternative to capitalism, and that that is alive and well here in the United States, where we now see millions and millions of people finding it normal and appropriate to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism over and against the strengths and weaknesses of socialist alternatives. What an achievement, given the 75 years of hysterical anti-communism and anti-socialism, making the United States almost the only country in the world where the socialism that is discussed everywhere else in the world had to become a taboo. He's broken that taboo in ways nobody on the left or the right or the middle would have thought possible as little as 5 years ago. He didn't do it by himself. I don't want to over-credit him. The Occupy Wall Street movement was an important step in that direction, as were others. But he is the point man who pulled that off, and he did it again last night in holding his own, being able to handle a Bloomberg, which is not a tough call given who Bloomberg is, but nonetheless, he did it, and you're right, the symbolism could not have been sharper and starker, as is the attempt of Mr. Bloomberg to buy his way into this job the way he has bought his way into the New York mayoralty, and so on. So absolutely, this is an astonishing achievement. I also think that it is a pipe dream. If Mr. Bloomberg were to become the next president under the cloud of the billionaire status he comes with, which is even worse than the similar billionaire status, whether it's true or fake, of Mr. Trump, I mean, it puts billionaires back to back in an economic system that is declining, that is discovering that the Europeans and the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians and so on are catching up on them bit by bit, year by year, that the relative dominance of the United States is less and less, and all the problems that come with that, those are then going to be managed by two billionaires who are already viewed as odd, as different, and as either disasters by half the population or as increasingly dubious saviors by the other half, their own half. So you really have a society, and that's, I think, what's worrying the people on Wall Street. You have a society that needs particularly creative political leadership and is in fact generating obtuse business mentalities who have everything that is the opposite of a sophisticated, nuanced political capacity for leadership. What Mr. Trump does is bloviate to a desperate part of the population that wants the theater, that wants to believe that the problems can be solved by whacking immigrants or being a white supremacist or bashing China. This is, a society that is going to grow out of these illusions. And Mr. Bloomberg brings in the illusion that because he was the right guy at the right time in the financialization of our economy with some technologies thrown in, that qualifies him to be the president. These illusions will be quickly gone through, and then what?
Well, and the only thing I would add to your characterization of these two gentlemen is that you left out the fact that they are cartoonishly mean, sexist creeps. But other than that, I wholeheartedly endorse your description. I guess in the couple, maybe I shouldn't do this since we only have a couple minutes, maybe it's a preview of our next conversation, but I would say that not only is the US in decline on the global stage, but that the global financial consensus reflected by banks, by central banks, by multilateral institutions of one kind or another, as well as by the politicians that are supported by said financial elites, that their worldview is enormously under challenge from left and right because it has, in my view, conspicuously failed to deliver on its promises or to provide stability. So, I mean, if you have a closing thought on that or just want to say, let's preview it for.
I agree. I mean, one of the reasons you see, whether it's the angry mass of the British working class voting for a Brexit, what a test case. Here are people who have suffered very badly. The British working class suffered more through the 10 years of austerity since the crash of 2008 than arguably almost any other working class, save perhaps for the Greeks, perhaps also the Italians. But yet, despite having suffered the most, were most easily distracted into the total illusion that the Europeans were somehow at the root of their problem, and that separating from Europe, going it alone in a world economy in which North America is a big bloc, the rest of Europe is a big bloc, China is a big bloc, Japan is in trouble because it isn't part of a big bloc, and they're not going to join Japan by being another offshore island all on its own. This is crazy. The British people aren't crazy, but you have to ask why you would have this illusion. Because the system isn't working, and yet it isn't yet possible for the people who suffer a system that isn't working to be able to identify that their problem is the system. They're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for somebody else to blame. And partly I sympathize. It would be nice if by separating from Europe, you could solve your problems, but you can't. And it might be acceptable, the morality put aside, to go after immigrants, the poorest of the poor, if it reasonably could solve your problem. But it can't, any more than bashing China can. And so eventually, you're going to have more and more people coming, reluctantly perhaps, to the conclusion that you need much more basic change. You need the kind of wrenching internal social change that you have wanted to avoid, that you have wanted to believe might not be necessary. I wish it weren't, but it is. And when systems die, that's how they die, as people go through a variety of hoped for easy outs and then discover that's really not going to solve the problem. I think we're getting closer with each week to that kind of what the French call denouement, the kind of the suddenly becoming aware of what you're really facing. And in a way, the movement towards Bernie is itself the recognition, particularly in young people, that something much more fundamental is at fault here in the United States, and they gravitate towards the person who at least sounds like he has some sense of that, because the rest of them sound so far removed.
I absolutely agree with that assessment. I certainly hope the optimistic dimension of it is true, and I think we should all internalize that and not get discouraged by the setbacks of the moment, whatever they may be at any given moment. So with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. But as always, Richard Wolff, economist, host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. As always, great speaking with you, and thanks for your insights.
Thank you, Richard. And again, my appreciation for your having a program that puts these kinds of conversations out there in the hopes that people will think about them and come up with their own contributions.